We're going to continue by thinking about barriers to market entry. The theory of monopolistic competition that we just looked at makes the rather extreme assumption that new entrants to the industry face no costs at all or any other barriers to entry. And it also assumes, although I haven't discussed that in any detail, it assumes that there are no barriers to leaving the industry as well. If there are such costs or barriers to entry, then some firms might not find it worthwhile to try to enter the market. It might simply be too costly. And in that case, the logic that we saw in the case of monopolistic competition, where new entrants drove economic profits down to zero, that story does not hold in such a case. So if there are significant entry costs, then that same logic would suggest that some economic profits could persist in the long term for the firms that are already in the market. And as we'll see later in the course, that is quite common in many kinds of markets, in other market structures that we haven't examined yet. Well, why might such barriers exist? What are these barriers that we're talking about? Probably one of the most commonly discussed barrier is called economies of scale, an idea that I think we've already touched on. So economies of scale is simply the idea that the average cost of production goes down as the rate of production measured over some certain period of time goes up. So in other words, if the firm's scale of production is higher, there's something going on that causes its average costs to be less than if it operated on a smaller scale. One cause of economies of scale is something that we have already discussed in a bit of detail, the idea that total fixed costs are going to play a role. So if total fixed costs are very large, then when we think about what average total costs are, we know that they come from average cost divided by the amount that's produced over a certain period of time, like a year. And that total cost can be split up into fixed costs and variable costs. So if total fixed costs are quite large, then as the rate of production, Q, we're calling it, rises, then average total cost is going to fall because we've got this total fixed cost that's essentially being divided by a larger and larger number, the larger the scale of production that the firm is undertaking. Perhaps an extreme case where total fixed costs really dominate would be the case where variable costs are extremely small. So, for example, if a publisher were to produce the electronic textbook, which you have in this course, its variable costs are going to be extremely small. So it can produce more copies of that book at essentially zero marginal cost. So in that case, all of its costs are fixed costs. Not quite the same thing holds, by the way, for things like downloadable software, where, yes, the actual marginal cost of providing you with a copy of that software is essentially zero, but software, of course, always comes with problems, and customers may need to contact the firm later and get assistance with those problems. So there would be service costs that would have to be considered. So in such a case, selling more units of a product would still involve at least some future variable costs that would have to be considered. Other sources of total fixed costs that we haven't discussed up to this date are things like spending on advertising, research and development, which are costs that have to be borne before a product can be produced at all, and then marketing costs in getting the product to market. And again, that's not going to be very directly connected to the amount that you're selling. Another cause or reason to have economies of scale can come about because if you increase the scale of output, that might allow you to produce things in a different way. So, very large scale of production might make assembly lines be organized differently. You might have a different division of labor within the firm. It might also allow the firm to use different kinds of machinery. So if a firm was going to produce at a much larger scale, different kinds of machinery might be appropriate. It might make sense to have more automated production, for example. Well, how relevant is this idea of economies of scale? I think there's pretty widespread agreement among economists that economies of scale are important in many industries, at least up to a certain rate of production. So we can illustrate these ideas in a picture just showing us what average costs are if we have economies of scale. So the idea is that as the rate of output gets higher, the average cost of production is going to decline. It may decline up to a point. So I've drawn this so that there's a flat part here. So economies of scale persist up until about here, and then average total costs become constant after that. That's at least one possibility. It could be the case that economies of scale continue across the whole range of output that is relevant to us. By the way, the text discusses the case of diseconomies of scale, which is the idea that average costs would start to rise at some point if the scale of production got large enough. Well, it's not clear at all that this is actually relevant in practice. Here the idea is that the firm can keep expanding production in a way that does not end up raising average costs. So all of the inputs that the firm uses could be changed if the firm has enough time. And perhaps it could simply replicate what it's been doing in one particular location and keep its costs the same. I'll finish the discussion of barriers to entry in the next section.